Hi, and welcome back to part 2 of my two-part series on the bucket strategy. I'm Ted Carr. Thank you for joining me. Let's take a look at what I'm going to cover today. I'm going to open up with an overview, followed by the key assumptions that I used in the presentation, draining bucket 1 and refilling bucket 1, rebalancing buckets, before I take a minute or two to wrap things up. Okay, so let's get started. As I said, this is part 2 of my two-part series on the bucket strategy. In part 1, I explained my approach to the bucket strategy, where I have 4 buckets. Most bucket strategies will show 3 buckets, and they're kind of based on a simple time dimension. Money that you need now, money you need soon, and money you need later. I prefer to classify my buckets according to investment categories. My bucket 1 contains cash and cash equivalents. Bucket 2 contains bonds and bond funds. Bucket 3 contains hybrid or balanced funds along with derivatives. And in bucket 4, that's where I have all of my equities. Now, if you haven't seen part 1, you might want to take a few minutes and check that out before proceeding with the rest of this presentation. I'd like to point out that these are guidelines and not procedures. And by that I mean the bucket strategy and managing buckets is really a framework from which to operate in. It gives you direction, it gives you a way to look at things, but you don't have to do everything literally or do everything exactly this way. Guidelines are helpful, but they're not restrictive. Now, buckets are logical groupings of investment accounts. By that I mean, I can't go online and see what's in my bucket 1, through a financial services firm or a brokerage firm. My buckets exist on paper, an Excel spreadsheet to be precise. So they're logical, they're virtual. They're not really accounts, if that makes sense. My standard disclaimer, my content is illustrative only. I'm not making recommendations or endorsements. I'm not a financial professional. Please do your own research, including consulting with your financial professional. And as always, your decisions are yours to make. A couple of announcements before we begin. I'd like to invite you to subscribe to this YouTube channel if you haven't already. It's a simple matter, I think, of clicking on the red subscribe button. Also, I invite you to subscribe to my podcast, which is now going to be called Later to Fire. It's currently called Firewalkers, but we're rebranding it to Later to Fire. It can be found on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, Player FM, and TuneIn Radio. So right now it's either under Firewalkers or Later to Fire, depending on the timing of the release of my video and me getting my act together and getting the Later to Fire podcast out there. I put out a free monthly newsletter called the Retire Hobby Roundup, and you can subscribe to that very simply by going to retirehobby.com and clicking on my newsletter sign up. That would be a great thing for you to do and to support the show. I'd like to point out that future videos are likely to be supporting the new Later to Fire podcast. My objective is to take a podcast topic and, if warranted, provide a video that amplifies the topic of the podcast to really cover it thoroughly. So I just want to set expectations that you'll probably hear future videos. In future videos, I'll be mentioning the podcast that is associated with. Assumptions that are baked into today's presentation. We're going to have 2 use cases, refilling bucket 1 and rebalancing buckets. Only one scenario out of the myriad possible scenarios, and that's we're doing this in the context of up markets. Bucket 1 is used for budget or living expenses and emergency funding. A budget contains living expenses and earmarks, and I'll explain that a little bit more in the next slide. Bucket 1 is refilled biannually, i.e. twice a year, and similarly, buckets are rebalanced twice a year. Income can be earned, passive, or both. A separate checking account is used to drain money from bucket 1. In this example, bucket 1 contains money market funds, a savings account, and a checking account. And out of that checking account comes spending for your living expenses from your budget and earmarks. And earmarks are another way of saying making sure your budget contains money that is set aside for special one-time expenditures. For example, a home remodel project, a new vehicle, a home repair, a vacation, something like that, where you put it in your budget for the budget cycle to make sure you have the cash on hand to actually go ahead and spend it on those earmarks, as well as your living expenses. And of course, bucket one is used to spend on emergencies out of your emergency fund, which logically exists within bucket one. Refilling bucket one. So we're going to do this at the start of the year, the first half. And let's take a look at our funding requirements. So our annual budget is, let's say, $60,000, and that means that the first half budget expenses are $30,000. A zero emergency fund. What that means is that the emergency fund is fully funded, so there's no need to add money into the funding requirements to top off the emergency fund. So net is the amount required to refill bucket one is $30,000. Funding for the $30,000 is accomplished this manner. First, we take a look to see if there's any residual funds in the money market account, the savings account, or the checking account. In this case, we're assuming there's $2,000 there. Great. We also are planning on having $10,000 worth of income in the first half. That gives a total of $12,000 that's available to help fill the $30,000 funding requirement. So where does the rest come from? Well, we actually take money in sequence out of buckets 2, 3, and 4 in that priority. So again, there's discretion here. It doesn't have to be too, as I said, too exact. You have a lot of discretion here. But in this case, we're taking $10,000 out of bucket 2, which could be from bond interest or a bond principal that's maturing, or we sold some bond funds, some shares out of our bond funds. $6,000 out of bucket 3. That could be dividends or distributions from a hybrid fund, for example, as well as interest, say, from a convertible bond fund, or dividends may be a better way of saying it. And finally, we get to bucket 4, where our stocks, our equities are, and we're taking $2,000 either in dividends or capital gains. So altogether, we get $18,000 from these buckets. And you can kind of see that priority I was talking about, where you took $10,000 from bucket 2, because that's our first go-to bucket, $6,000 from bucket 3, and $2,000 from bucket 4, for $18,000, which means we've completely filled our bucket 1 for our requirements of $30,000. Let's take a look at use case number 2, rebalancing buckets, again for the first half. So we're assuming, just to make numbers easy for me to, to work with, a portfolio of $500,000. And bucket 1 is full. Our emergency fund, likewise, is $20,000, and it is full. There's $30,000 that comprises our first half budget. So one of the key things to point out here is the notion that you have an idea of what your target asset allocation percentages are. And this, again, is across 4 buckets, which is the way I do it. So the target allocation percentage-wise is 10% for cash and cash equivalents, 20% for bonds, bond funds, i.e. fixed income, 20% in balanced funds and derivatives, and 50% is in equities for a total of 100%. Breaking it down by dollars, you see $50,000, $100,000, $100,000, and $250,000. Now, here's where we're at in terms of our first half actual amounts. We have refilled bucket 1, so we have $50,000 in bucket 1. We have $70,000 in bucket 2 because we were putting money from bucket 2 into bucket 1, $65,000 in bucket 3, $315,000 in bucket 4. Now, percentage-wise, you'll see that we're okay with respect to our asset allocation goal for bucket 1. We're now a little bit under for bucket 2, as you probably would expect, because we took a lot of money out of bucket 2 to refill bucket 1 with. We're similarly down for bucket 3, 13% versus our target of 20%, and we're up 63%, versus 50%, which is our target asset allocation. So now this is where your discretion and sort of your situation comes into play within the context of an market now. That's how what we're talking about here. So we're looking at our variances here, and you can see, as I mentioned, that you've got $65,000 that you would need to rebalance out of bucket 4. Now, what you could do is simply put $35,000 into bucket 3, $30,000 into bucket 2, and you stay with this target asset allocation percentage-wise. It gets everything topped up back to where you were. However, you may say, oh, it's an up market. Maybe I want to change my asset allocation for my equities and maybe leave it the way it is, right? And then make some other adjustments, or put it at maybe 55%. So this is where sort of the judgment comes into play, is how you decide to adjust your targets based on the circumstances, and of course, how you've gone about spending and refilling your buckets and how they've performed. So this is just a great exercise to make sure you're looking at your investments and aligning your investments with your goals in the market and where you're at in terms of filling your overall financial plan. So I think that's kind of a neat thing about the bucket strategy, is that it really helps encourage you to look at your investments and to make sure the way you're investing, your asset allocation, aligns with what your goals are. So let's wrap things up here. Great thing about the bucket strategy, I hope after watching my 2 videos, is that it is pretty easy to understand conceptually, but I think after watching part 2, you may agree with me that it is challenging to manage. Takes a little bit of time, but I think it's a great discipline to undertake. It's not an exercise in precision, as you say. There's a difference between a framework and procedure. So it's a framework within which to operate. And honestly, my buckets rarely align perfectly with my asset allocation, but I have my targets and I'm constantly, fine-tuning them. And that's where the magic and I think the power of one of the benefits of the bucket strategy comes into play. Again, help you better understand your investments, because you have to take a look at it every twice a year at least. And again, it facilitates asset allocation, which is important because that's where you're aligning your risk with your rewards and your goals. And I just invite you to please share my video with people who you think would be interested in learning about the bucket strategy, probably fellow finance nerds, Excel people. And please feel free to leave your comments. Love to hear your thoughts on what you're doing, what you think. My next video is TBD. I produced 2 new podcast episodes already, and I'll have to see if one of those podcast episodes warrants a new video. So that's TBD. And above all, thanks for your attention. Thanks for joining me. Appreciate it. And I just want to say take care. And until next time, all the best.